So welcome to the January meeting for the Woodstock Housing Committee. We're super excited to have some special guests this month from the Woodstock Land Conservancy and from the Hudson Valley Alliance for Housing and Conservation. And now I will turn it over to John.
Thanks, and thanks again to everyone from Woodstock Land Conservancy and to Steve for joining us tonight. And before we get into it, I thought I would just spend a little time talking about the motivation here. The main agenda item tonight is to talk with the Land Conservancy about the simultaneous pursuit of housing and conservation goals. And some people might think that that's sort of an odd objective, that pursuing housing and conservation together seems a bit odd. And so while that's often true, it doesn't have to be true. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about our motivations on the Housing Committee for trying to think some of our problems through with the Land Conservancy. First of all, I think everyone on the committee and most of the people who live in Woodstock do so in large part because we get a lot of joy from the natural beauty, the ruggedness, the rural qualities of the community. And we do not want to diminish those qualities in pursuit of affordable housing. And we don't think the town would or should accept any housing affordability strategies that would have a meaningful negative effect on the town's natural beauty. At the same time, though, we think that one of the things we really value about Woodstock is the culture that it has created through its collection of interesting and unique individuals. It's a town where a wide range of people, including artists, musicians, entrepreneurs, seniors, families with young children, among many other types, can thrive and feel welcome. And it is the interest in our interest in preserving that culture that motivates many of us working on the issue of housing affordability. So we view that preservation of that culture as an important dimension of community preservation. And we interacted with a lot of people in the community through events that the Housing Committee has sponsored, and we feel like what I just expressed really is also the center of gravity in the town, that they value both the natural beauty and its conservation along with the culture of the town. And right now, the goal of preserving that culture is really threatened by the housing affordability crisis. A lot of people who might want to live here, who would be welcome here, simply can't afford it. So there's a tension between the two goals, but if we want to pursue them simultaneously, which we think we should, we just have to start figuring out how to address that tension. So our hope is that tonight's meeting can help us start creating more information about how this might be possible, to create relationships that might help us to navigate the challenges that we're going to face. And that's sort of the motivating underlying premise here. A couple of examples that give us hope that this is going to be possible. Sometimes it's very small scale. We've seen an example from Wellfleet on Cape Cod, where there was a small piece of waterfront property that had a small cottage on it. It was a perfect lot for constructing high-end housing, but the town wanted the community to have access to the property, and they needed affordable housing. So they worked with the Conservancy to purchase the property. They preserved the cottage, and it became a home for a town employee. And then the Conservancy took charge of managing the property in a way that provided a public benefit. There's larger scale examples that are closer to home. I'm sure most of you here are familiar with the exciting project that Red Hook has gotten off the ground, where they're going to build workforce housing on a property that's also going to conserve farmland and create some public space for conservation of natural habitat. And so I'm sure that example is going to come up more tonight. So to try to start the conversation, the meeting is going to have several parts. First, two members of our committee, Rebecca Brooks and Sabina Barak, reached out to members of community preservation committees and neighboring communities to learn more about their work. It's important to note that we in Woodstock don't have a committee like this. And so they learned about strategy these communities have used to create community preservation funds, which can be funded by a real estate transfer tax. And Rebecca's going to talk a little bit about some of what she's learned from those conversations. Second, Steve Rosenberg is here, And he's going to share thoughts with us. Steve's a co-convener of the Hudson Valley Alliance for Housing and Conservation. He's also had considerable experience working with organizations that pursue land conservation. And he's a leader in trying to promote projects that advance conservation and housing. And he's going to share some of his ideas and experiences with us. So after Rebecca and Steve make their short presentations, then we can start having our conversations. And I know that the three people that I know are here are Andy Mossy, who's the executive director of Woodstock Land Conservancy, Kevin Smith, who's the board chair, and Patty Goodwin is the president. Are all of you here? Yes. All right, that's great. And I don't know, I don't see anyone else from the Land Conservancy that's joined. That's right. Is that correct? Okay, and so the three of them will then join our conversation, and I feel like we'll begin by talking about this idea of a community preservation fund. This is, as I mentioned, sometimes funded by a real estate transfer tax. There's examples in Long Island where these funds are also used for housing. And so maybe it's possible for Woodstock to do something that could jointly fund both projects. So we can talk about, we don't know what's possible, but we can talk about what the community might want and what the Conservancy might be interested in. And then finally, we can let Andy and Patty and Kevin just share their thoughts and start the conversation about the limits and possibilities of collaborating either on specific projects they might have in mind or more abstractly about things that might be possible. So that was my thoughts about tonight, and I'll stop there. Anyone want to say anything before we keep going? Well, why don't I introduce Rebecca Brooks, who's going to present what she learned along with Sabina during the conversations with members of community preservation committees from neighboring towns.
Thank you, John. Can everyone hear me all right?
Yep.
Great, excellent. I'm going to share my screen to present what we learned. Alrighty. All right, so the last committee meeting, we all shared ideas about strategies that we can suggest to the town board for creating more affordable housing. One of Sabina's suggestions was to reach out to other communities who are working towards the same goals we are. So this month, Sabina, Deborah, and I had a conversation with key committee members from Gardner, Marbletown, and New Paltz. These discussions focused on the experiences of these towns in implementing community preservation efforts, and particularly as they relate to land conservation and community collaboration. So what we learned is that these towns have worked closely with partners like Scenic Hudson, the Open Space Institute, and local land trusts. These partnerships were invaluable in supporting their land preservation and conservation efforts. Collaboration has been crucial as those organizations can also help bring money to the table. Engaging experts such as GIS mapping specialists, local farmers, and water resource experts has been key to crafting comprehensive plans. So the mechanism by which these towns have most recently been pursuing conservation is through a Community Preservation Fund, or CPF, which was made possible through the Community Preservation Act. These funds are set aside specifically for the preservation of open space, farmland, and historic sites. In these communities, the CPF is funded through a real estate transfer tax, which is applied to property sales paid by the buyer, and specifically only sales amounts in excess of the county's average median sales price. By enacting a local law that allows for this transfer tax, these towns have been able to create a dedicated funding source that has enabled them to preserve valuable land and resources. As mentioned before, the town of Red Hook is another community who has enacted a CPF and has begun to use its funds to protect 169 acres of land through 2 collaborative projects with Scenic Hudson, the Duchess Land Conservancy, and Rupco. The projects involved purchasing properties like the Cookingham farmland, which had high conservation priority, and setting aside portions for agriculture and housing. One parcel includes prime farmland protected by a conservation easement, ensuring it remains affordable for future farmers. Additionally, 12 acres of land are being used for affordable housing in partnership with Rupco, with plans for rental apartments and single-family homes. The town also protected a 72-acre parcel, which includes agricultural land and forested areas, and plans to create public recreational trails linking to local parks. So in our conversations with these towns, we wondered how the idea of establishing a real estate transfer tax was received by their communities. When it comes to the ballot referendum to enact funding like this, the committee members noted the importance of holding a vote during an important local election, as it helps to draw people out to the polls. These towns also had to ensure that people were well informed about the ballot referendum. This included efforts to clearly explain the nature of a transfer tax, emphasizing that it wasn't an additional property tax, which can often create fear. And while cooperation has been generally positive, challenges initially emerged around securing buy-in from the local real estate industry, particularly with opposition to property-related taxes. However, they noted this has actually improved over time, and there is a growing acceptance in these communities regarding that tax structure when it's well communicated. There were many steps involved in getting to the point of a ballot referendum, and much documentation needed to be put together. The Natural Resource Inventory, or NRI, is one such critical document that maps out and inventories the natural resources in the area. It's typically GIS-based, and it helps provide a clear understanding of what natural assets exist and where they are located. For the towns, they utilize professional help, including Cornell Extension, DEC, and GIS specialists to compile the NRI. The other documents they prepared were the Comprehensive Plan, Open Space Plan, and then the Community Preservation Plan. This documentation process created a robust foundation for the CPF, which not only identified resources for conservation, but also outlined strategies for working with stakeholders and securing funding. Regardless of the direction we go, they highly recommended having in place a natural resource inventory. This will really serve to prioritize areas for conservation based on ecological value, such as water bodies, forests, wetlands, wildlife habitats, and agricultural lands. Tying back to the idea of housing, once a community preservation fund is created, they advised us that it takes time for a CPF to build up funds. A lot of these communities enacted the tax in time for the surging real estate market, and they were able to build theirs up fairly quickly. That may not be the case today. So for housing in particular, we should expect it to take time to build. Overall, these communities were open and generous with their knowledge and experiences. They shared valuable resources, connections, and offered to provide written materials and plans that we can adapt for our own efforts. It was evident that collaboration and cooperation are at the heart of their success, and they are here to support us on this journey. Additionally, it's clear that we have strong partners like Scenic Hudson and other local organizations who are committed to helping guide and support us through this process. The spirit of collaboration and mutual support is something we can certainly lean on as we work to shape our own path forward.
Thanks so much, Rebecca. This is really useful. Before we react to it and start brainstorming about it, let's hear from Steve Rosenberg from the Alliance. Steve?
Thanks so much, John, and thanks, Rebecca, for that summary. I think it's important. I want to clarify a couple of points about community preservation funds. Also, just a little additional sort of introduction. It's great to see all of you. I really appreciate the opportunity to join you tonight. It's wonderful that this conversation across sector between the Housing Committee and the Land Conservancy is happening at all. It's unusual around the Valley and elsewhere, so it's really encouraging to be a part of it. I was at Scenic Hudson for over 30 years, worked with Deborah Dewan for part of that, was the director of the Scenic Hudson Land Trust, and also was on the board of the Land Trust Alliance, the national board of the Alliance. So long history in land conservation, and for many, many years, I was intrigued by the sort of lack of intersection, if you will, between the two sectors. In my own community, I live in Rhinebeck. In the village, in 2006, I asked the town if they would allow me to create a committee, and we created an open space and affordable housing committee and brought in a planning consultant and created recommendations which made their way into the town's comprehensive plan back then. So it's been a long-term interest of mine. In 2022, with an affordable housing professional, Rebecca Gilman-Crimmins. We invited 5 conservation land trusts and 5 nonprofit affordable housing groups in the region to come together and focused, and really it's sort of zeroing in on your meeting this evening, focusing first on building relationships and trust. The 2 sectors, the individuals and the organizations, didn't know one another. They didn't know how the other worked and operated on a day-to-day basis. And frankly, unfortunately, the 2 sectors sometimes, and the general public, carry around a lot of baggage about one or the other. And there's a lot of mythology about the way each sector operates and what the outcomes are. I think anyone who works for a land trust is often sometimes pulling their hair out because of a newspaper article that gets it wrong, or someone they meet in the public who doesn't understand the way a conservation transaction occurred or what the outcome would be. And similarly, in the affordable housing sector, there's a great deal of mythology or wrong information that's out there. I want to speak specifically, because that's what you asked me to talk about, of some examples of sort of success stories that have been generated so far. I think the first thing is just to note that what started off as just an informal conversation about whether these groups in the 2 sectors could collaborate has now sort of taken on a bit more form and shape. It is called, as John said, the Hudson Valley Alliance for Housing and Conservation. It has grown from 10 organizations to 16. The most recent groups to join are a new community land trust based in Columbia County called Trillium, and the Open Space Institute. You're familiar with, I think, probably most, if not all, of the other organizations in the Alliance, and I can put our website in the chat a little bit later, and you can see all of the organizations. A couple of clarifying things about community preservation funds, just because I worked on them for many, many years. I think the most important is community preservation funds cannot be used for housing, and Red Hook did not use community preservation funds to acquire the 12 acres in Red Hook that they're collaborating with RUPCO on. They had an incentive zoning fee in place, which generated over time dollars, which they were able to use to acquire that portion of the property. And they collaborated with Scenic Hudson and Duchess Land Conservancy to conserve the farm piece, and that was subsequently transferred, subject to a conservation easement, to Hardy Roots Organic Farm, and so has the potential to be a great success story. I also just want to note that not just any community has the legal authority, even from Albany, to create a community preservation fund. As Rebecca said, the real estate sort of lobby, if you will, works pretty hard to against these things. But in the Hudson, there's a specific Hudson Valley Community Preservation Fund, and communities in Westchester, Putnam, and Ulster have the authority to have a referendum and then adopt them. So success stories, housing and conservation, and you know why it might make sense for the 2 sectors to collaborate. One is, you know, leveraging dollars and resources. So that parcel in Red Hook, the 12 acres, in a normal, if it was a pure conservation transaction, the land trust and or the town would have had to buy the entire thing. In this case, the land trusts were able to collaborate and only have to participate in the funding and conservation of a portion of it, because the other part, the other 12 acres, lent themselves very well adjacent to, or actually in the village of Red Hook, adjacent to water and sewer, didn't have to get involved in the funding of that. And I should point out, it was a representative of one of the land trusts that brought the opportunity to the table. And that is one of the key things about the relationships. If the relationships don't exist, the land conservation groups or the housing groups are not sort of their antennas not up to identify potential opportunities that can benefit the other sector as well as themselves. Second is, I think these projects are helping the land trusts and the affordable housing groups to clarify sort of strategic priorities, really identify what is important to accomplish their mission and what is less so. And by doing that, it helps them to save resources and direct resources to the things that are the highest priority. It's also a strong, probably the strongest alignment between the two sectors is around climate. Which initially sort of surprised me, but the Nature Conservancy is the largest funder of our first phase of work. They weren't initially a member of the Alliance, they are now. And what they said was, we're telling millions of people who live in vulnerable locations in coastal areas that they're going to have to move. Maybe we have a responsibility to help identify less vulnerable places where they can live. But what we've also learned through the process is how much affordable housing projects sort of check all of the boxes of what land use planners and conservationists call smart growth. They have to be efficiently organized, typically served by water and sewer, though not always, typically walkable. You can't build affordable housing without some subsidy. Those subsidies require them to be the most energy efficient buildings going and meet many green design standards. I feel very comfortable saying most all affordable housing projects are greener than any typical market rate housing project. They also, because of how they're located from a conservation perspective, they are not causing the sort of slicing and dicing of the countryside that the typical large lot zoning in Hudson Valley communities, frankly, is a recipe for. So climate, biodiversity, creating wildlife corridors are all strengthened through the collaboration and prioritization of lands that are most important for conservation and identifying those other places that lend themselves well to affordable housing solutions. Last thing I'll say is one of the other on sort of why it makes sense. Many land conservation organizations in the region are focused on farmland protection, local agriculture, and access to local food as part of their mission. And there's a group called the Farmer Housing Working Group, which has come into being in the Hudson Valley over the past couple of years. And they did a survey of farmers old and young across the valley. And the number one threat that they determined to the ongoing sort of health and sustainability of local agriculture in the Hudson Valley was the inaccessibility of affordable housing to the people who owned, operated, and worked on farms. So it's a challenge that makes sense for the conservation community and the housing community to work on together. So a few examples that have begun to emerge from our alliance's work. We talked about the Red Hook one, which is everyone is very proud of. In Kingston, the Kingston Land Trust acquired something called the Mason Hill Farm as part of their Land in Black Hands project. The City of Kingston and Scenic Hudson have just collaborated with the city, planning to use community preservation funds to help acquire it on the acquisition of a parcel immediately next door to the Mason Hill Farm. And the goal is that there will be agriculture, there will be conserved open space that will be publicly accessible, and there will be the development of some amount of affordable housing on the land that the city is acquiring. In Marbletown, frankly, one of the reasons why the Open Space Institute became interested in the effort, I shouldn't say that, they were always sort of interested in the effort, but really wanted to join it, was they heard about the Red Hook project, and they are now collaborating with the town of Marbletown. They have acquired, I believe it's a 90-acre parcel, 75 of which will be set aside for conservation, and the remaining 15 acres they intend to transfer to the town, which can be used for other uses, likely to include affordable housing. Another way that the groups have collaborated is through this, again, through the relationship. So Hudson River Housing and the Dutchess Land Conservancy. in Eastern Dutchess County. Hudson River Housing is a regional nonprofit affordable housing group, but they don't. The affordable housing groups don't necessarily evaluate a parcel of land in the same way that a land trust would. But those two organizations are sitting down together. So Hudson River Housing takes a potential opportunity and they sit down with staff from the Dutchess Land Conservancy and ferret out, what are the conservation resources here that we as a housing group should steer away from? Does it make sense for us to develop this property? Then once they've had that conversation, if they do proceed, they're in a stronger position to go with an actual proposal to the community that will hopefully achieve the housing goals without sacrificing conservation outcomes. In New Lebanon, another example, which is in Columbia County, Eastern Columbia County, this didn't involve an actual conservation outcome, but it was the relationships that led to this point. The local farmers market was looking to construct a new structure for a permanent indoor farmers market home and also wanted to include housing in the structure. Nobody in New Lebanon, in this group of individuals and organizations that was working on it, knew who to talk to about that. And so one of the staff members of the Columbia Land Conservancy introduced them to Hudson River Housing, which is now an integral part of the project. So there are a lot of different ways that we are seeing the partnerships, the relationships result in unexpected, unanticipated outcomes, which are very encouraging to us. I will mention two other things and then I'll be quiet so you can continue the conversation. One is that we're, and I know, comprehensive planning and that process locally is important to people in Woodstock and all over the Hudson Valley. But anyone who's familiar with comprehensive plans realizes, I think now, that each of the sort of themes or sections of the plan are typically done by a separate committee which focuses on that, and then it sort of goes into a silo in the plan. And there's a separate chapter on that. But there's never an attempt made to actually rationalize, prioritize, and rub through the areas where there's potential collisions. And so what it is then is sort of a setup for conflict later. And it often occurs in the area of conservation and housing. Until recently, a lot of comprehensive plans in the Hudson Valley didn't even have a housing section, let alone one that focused on affordable housing. So the idea is the Alliance is partnering with Pattern for Progress, the Pace University Land Use Law Center, and the Hudson River Estuary Program to work with, on a pilot basis, a single community in Columbia County to help them through a process of creating sort of a roadmap to integrate how they plan for both, so that they've identified in advance, these are the priority conservation areas. These areas make more sense. These are the types of land use regulations that can incentivize development or conservation in the right places. And our community has had a conversation through this process so that it doesn't then come as a surprise later. Last thing I will mention, I'm sorry, two more things. One is on the policy front. I think, John, you mentioned the potential for, or that on Long Island, they had adopted community housing funds. So in 2022, for the first time in the state, 4 towns in Eastern Long Island secured authorization from Albany to enact community housing funds. That all 4 of them already had a community preservation fund, and they had a 1.5% transfer fee. The community housing fund was added on top of that with an additional 0.5%. So those towns now, and before you can spend any money, you have to have a plan, are going through a planning process to adopt locally generated housing, affordable housing plans and conservation plans, so that, and they will actually have funds. No municipalities have any money to spend on this stuff, to begin to invest directly. And the last thing, finally, that I will mention is there is interest all over the country now in this topic. At the last National Conference of Land Trusts, called the Rally every year, there were 3 separate sessions on this topic. And I am collaborating with a couple of other people around the country on creating a national peer group of land trusts that are interested in the intersection between affordable housing and conservation. We've had, I think it was 80 to 100 individuals from land trusts all over the country who've expressed interest. We've had a series of Zoom calls, and it's our hope, either in collaboration with the Land Trust Alliance or in some other form, to launch this peer group as sort of a learning, information sharing network for land trusts starting this coming spring. So anyway, I will leave it there and welcome any questions you may have.
Well, thanks so much, Steve, and thanks again, Rebecca. I think it's time to hear from the Woodstock Land Conservancy. I noticed Kevin had to leave, but he left us a couple questions which we can circle back to or take on now. And Andy and Patty are still here, so maybe you could start with some general thoughts about the goals here and what you've been hearing, and limits and possibilities of what you think are should be on the table right now.
Well, just to start off, for those, it's nice to see so many people who I do recognize. And so hi to those of you who I know, and to those who I don't, my name is Andy Mossy, Executive Director at Woodstock Land Conservancy. And for those of you who know what the Woodstock Land Conservancy is all about, we certainly care about conservation. It's within our mission statement. But we also care about many other things that you may or may not know about, including trail connectivity, climate change, educational programs, and also coming on to our strategic plan, which I'm sure Patty would love to speak about, is thinking about housing as well. So this is a topic that WLC has been aware of for some time. And really now it's a great opportunity for us to say thank you for convening a conversation like this and kind of getting the ball rolling in the town of Woodstock, to think about how we can take on some of these initiatives in a holistic manner. In many ways, land trusts have always been siloed. We do conservation or we do XYZ. And then maybe a housing initiative or some other advocacy group would talk about that. And what we're coming to learn as land trusts and as people who care about our environment is we have to think about all these issues holistically. Otherwise, we all kind of lose out in many ways. And our community and our natural resources and the planning that goes into these factors need to be thought of, and we don't necessarily have to do it on our own. That's where that power of partnership comes in. That's been hit on so many times. So we're just happy to be at the table.
Thanks. Patty?
And I will add to that, as Andy teed up, it in our strategic plan, our most recent strategic plan, is along with a focus on dealing with the effects of climate change, is looking at community values as one area in which we want to operate and in which we want to use as one of the lenses that we look at land conservation with. And so that really brings up this conversation, and I think it also brings up the question of what constitutes sustainability and the right place to put housing when you're looking at a piece of land which might be conserved or might be used for affordable housing. And I think having a conservation organization be part of that conversation, as Steve has said, and I think as the Red Hook Project eloquently demonstrates, using both of those lenses, the community needs and the conservation values of a property and a project, and having them work together is really, really important. And I think that's what we would love to be a part of in this conversation. And if there are projects or initiatives going forward.
Have either of you thought about specific projects that might be on your table now, or more abstractly that could come on in the future? We're trying to visualize what kind of collaboration you might think could work.
Well, we certainly love.
Andy, do you want?
Yeah, sure. We certainly love the idea of some of the town lands that do exist that have pretty good access to major thoroughfares. So, for example, on Xena Road, near 28, there is a town property that is very close to the Ashokan Rail Trail. It's very close to the Stewarts that's in that location. And it's also very close to Bluestone Wild Forest. The only thing that it's
And
not very close
transit.
and transit, which is critical, especially when we're talking about affordable housing. And that was going to be my other point, which is that the only thing it's not really close to is the center of town, which, as we know, for people who are living in affordable housing circumstances, not everyone has a car or would even want to drive. And that goes both ways as well. It's not just affordable housing folks. So the areas closer to town are certainly ideal to make sure that people have access to services, health, human services, and so on. But as Patty was hinting at, there are some opportunities when we think about UCAT and we think about some of these other facilities that can be implemented. So there's probably many, many other locations that we could discuss, but those are kind of some of the hints that we've been observing.
So, Andy, just let me follow up with a question. So you've been thinking about the 5 properties that are currently being evaluated by the engineers. Is that where those thoughts came from?
Well, I mean, where it came from originally was probably far before that. I mean, the town has owned these properties for quite a while, and I think some are better options than others, and ultimately, it needs more of a conversation to come about in order to properly evaluate each one of these to see exactly where a project should take place. So right now, I think we can brainstorm and kind of talk about pros and cons and so on. But generally speaking, I think WLC's role is being able to kind of evaluate the natural resource value that any particular parcel may have, and then thinking of ways that we can work with the town and the developer to protect the natural resources of that given project. So, you know, putting forward a recommendation on a specific property may not be the best option for WLC, or we may not be the best voice for that. But as projects come up, and especially if there are specific parcels that are even for sale that aren't town properties and they seem like good fits, WLC would love to be a part of those conversations. So that's really where we see, or I see, our role, and I'll let Patty speak for herself. And so please think of us as a resource. We've done our own efforts in our town, as well as the neighboring towns, to identify where very key and critical resources are, that we think are of value to protect. And so we would obviously want to make sure that we're upholding those conservation values as much as possible, but we can also identify where there might be some other locations that may be better options for a project such as this.
I pretty much agree with what Andy has said. And I think a lot of people associate us more with being anti-development or developer. And very specifically, recently, with the Stop Xena development, which to us is kind of a poster child for the wrong project in the wrong place. And maybe I shouldn't be saying this, but it is the advocacy that we're kind of most involved with at the moment. But it really, I think it shows that even as there are wrong places, there are also right places. And I don't think we have a property that we own or that we know of that we would say, oh yes, that is the one. But should something come up, I think we would certainly be interested in being part of the conversation.
Do other members of the housing committee have questions for Patty or Andy, or comments about what's happening here?
Yeah, I had a question. So the natural resource inventory document was mentioned. Is that anything that's been on your radar or something that you would find useful or already in the works perhaps?
I think Woodstock has one. I think Hudsonia did
Okay.
one. Deborah, am I correct? Wouldn't you consider that a natural resource?
Yes, it's worth looking back at to see if it's an actual NRI. I do believe so. I just haven't looked at it recently. And to see what resources are already in place and if they need any updating or I see Ken Panza there, and I think Ken, you probably know the answer to that question.
Well, Woodstock, I adopted a natural resources inventory probably about 2 years ago.
It
And,
was
fully GIS based. We have all the maps on GIS. Judith Kerman has all those maps. Was developed with the cooperation of the DEC. The Land Conservancy was involved in that, and several other organizations. So I think we're quite well situated as far as the natural resources inventory. Of course, our comprehensive plan has an extensive section on affordable housing. Our open space plan is dated back probably to the early 1990s, done by a group from the University of Pennsylvania, and it's impenetrable. Not an easy document to read, but we're classified as having one. I don't know if anyone knows actually exists, but I think from the documentation viewpoint, we're pretty well covered.
That's great. Thank you.
Thank
Thanks.
you. I'm trying to do this without hand raising or whatever. Sometimes that works on Zoom and sometimes it doesn't. Anyone else want to chime in here? Steve?
Yeah, sorry, I couldn't help but raise my hand. So first of all, I'm sharing in the chat the link to the Alliance's website. But first of all, I really appreciated, Patty, your sharing what's in the new strategic plan for the Land Conservancy, and it
It's
sounds
actually
really
an old, it's not brand new. It's
okay.
actually the one that we're almost at the end of, but it's the newest we have.
Okay. Okay, but I, really appreciated the values that you expressed that are in that and important to the Land Conservancy. I wanted to, and I would encourage you. I don't know if Adam Bosch, who's the head of Pattern for Progress, has been to Woodstock to make a presentation on housing needs. He and I actually presented together to the Ulster County Environmental Management Council, which was really interesting. And it's so important, I think, to be sort of aware of, this question of who is affordable housing for these days, who lives in affordable housing. And it is such a broad segment of our communities now. Seniors, people who work in many of the jobs and places that you frequent, people who work for government, hospitals, etc. And things like, actually many of them, if not all of them, do have cars and do have access to transportation. It's important to just to think about it, and I think in a really broad way. And similarly, I think it's like you're saying, important for housing advocates to appreciate the values that are reflected in a natural resource inventory for a community, and those sort of special stellar places that absolutely a community needs to conserve. And it's through those conversations that you can find the sweet spots. Anyway, just wanted to share that.
Steve, I don't know if you saw this, but Kevin put some specific questions about the Cookingham property in the chat. I don't know if you have responses to those.
Let's see here. I wasn't involved in the actual structuring of the transaction, but I'll share what my understanding is. So I think they were separate parcels that, so the community preservation funds could be directed solely to those parcels that were part of the farm. Or that would continue to be in farming. And I believe that I'm fairly certain the town actually negotiated the acquisition of the parcel. There was a house on the parcel. There's a barn on the parcel. And then I believe Scenic Hudson contributed part of the cost to put the easement in place when the land was then transferred to Hardy Roots. The town, I believe, put out a request for proposals or put it on the market in effect so that anybody could buy it. And there were other farmers in the community, I believe, who also made submitted offers. But Hardy Roots had the highest offer. And then, like I said, the separate 12 acres was acquired by the town with the use of these incentive zoning fees. I don't know if they had to augment that with other town resources. I don't think so.
Can I ask a quick question,
Sure.
Steve? The housing is, somebody had told me recently that it was mainly affordable housing, but that there was also a small piece of property that was going to be used for market rate housing as well. Am I mistaken?
I can't say I'm 100% sure. My understanding is that RUPCO will be the developer of the affordable housing. And the way it works is you typically, what's considered affordable is based on a formula of someone being able to afford not wanting people to have to pay more than 30% of their income towards their housing costs. And so what they do is they look at the area median income, and then they say, so if somebody makes that amount, how much, if you spent 30% of your income, could you afford to pay on rent? And a particular project will then target a range of area median income. So it might be from 40 to 80% of area median, or it might be 60 to 110% of area median. And then those units within the project would become available to people who fall into those income ranges. The Red Hook project, as I understand it, they're proposing, as I think Rebecca mentioned, 20 rental units and 20 small single family homes. And I think they're, from what I understand, not going to be sort of at the very lower end of that range, but I don't know exactly what the range is. It is possible, in the way it's communicated, that some of them will be sold for more than 100% of the area median income. That doesn't mean it's a market rate project. And one other thing that happened as part of that, the town and RUPCO needed infrastructure funding to be able to develop the water and sewer infrastructure on the site to connect to town water and sewer and village water and sewer. And all 10 of the organizations, including all 5 of the land trusts, signed a letter of support for water and sewer infrastructure for a housing project for a grant from the state. And the town and RUPCO secured, I think it was $3.4 million from the state. And I think it's probably the first time 5 land trusts have signed a letter of support for a project like that.
Steve, one last question there about the synergies between housing costs burden and transportation cost burden.
Is it in the, can you speak to the additional synergies between reducing housing cost burden and transportation cost burden? Well, I mean, I think it's, I'm not an expert. I usually start off whenever I talk by saying I'm not an affordable housing expert. I've learned a lot, but I'm not an expert. If we think about it, anyone who doesn't make a lot of money to begin with in the broader scheme of things and is spending 30% of that income or more for housing doesn't have a lot of extra money to spend on other things. And so to the extent that you are able to limit your housing cost, and especially if you're living in a project that is located in a village and you, for example, if you work in a village, in the village where you're living, it frees up money to spend for other things, including transportation. One of the things I hear a lot from people is, who is this housing for? We want it for people who are from our community. But the reality is many of the people who work in your community don't currently live there because they can't afford to. So almost by design, the housing could or should serve people who don't currently live in the community, but who work there.
Is it possible to give priority to people who live or work in the community?
This is an area, there's fair housing law, which imposes at the federal and state level various restrictions on what sort of priorities you can establish and for whom. For seniors, for example, for people who live within a certain distance. My understanding is, and don't quote me on this, because it is a technical legal area, that I think there was a project that RUPCO was doing in Tannersville where they negotiated a certain number that would be for people who currently live in Greene County. And they had to, I think, at least review that with state and or federal officials to at least get sort of an informal sign off on that it wouldn't contravene fair housing laws, because you don't want to be using guidelines or prioritization like that as a way to, for example, keep a community that's a certain way that way forever.
I also think, and I'm not fully informed here, but the extent to which those constraints bind depends a bit on where the money comes from for the project, and to the extent it's coming from the privates, say someone from the town donated the land and the costs, you'd have different constraints than you do if you have a grant from the state or other kinds of things like that.
Right. Right. Yeah. The land conservation groups and the affordable housing groups share one really huge important thing in common, is they can't exist without access to land. And that, where we started by leveraging resources, where conservation groups might own or have access to parcels that aren't entirely important for conservation purposes, can make a huge difference to an affordable housing organization. And vice versa. RUPCO owns a property that's absolutely beautiful in the city of Kingston that has about 10 acres of undeveloped woodland that is not developable, but would be wonderful as a public access opportunity for the people who live in that and others, but they don't have the resources or expertise to be able to develop that for public use. And there are lots of examples like that as well.
As we're talking about projects, just something that always comes to mind for me is these amazing tools that we've really come to learn about over the past even 10 years, and conservation subdevelopments and how things are organized, and how we're planning and zoning and all these different factors that can go into just a smart planning process and making sure that there is this balance that we've been hinting at all throughout this entire meeting. And I think that's the big takeaway from all this, is we need to think about land use and land use law in the way of balance. So if a project is proposed in one way or the other, if we're not taking these factors into consideration, then we're really doing a disjustice to our community, essentially. So just for what it's worth.
So I think we're coming to the end of our time, but I just wanted to recognize that Anula Cordes is here. She's a member of the town board, and nothing is going to happen on anything of importance in the town without the town board's support. So I wanted to say thank you very much for taking the time and coming and listening, Anula, and also to offer, if you have any questions or comments you'd like to make at this point, please.
No questions, but thank you very much for that. And really, this was very informative for me. I've got 2 pages of notes, and I'll be reaching out to folks, John, you and Catherine, to ask some follow-up questions. But really, very informative, and I love the collaboration.
So thank you. And the last thing I think I'll say is, first, some things I learned. First, we're evaluating these town-owned lands. We've been doing it as best we can, but it makes sense to take advantage of Andy and the WLC's expertise as we think through projects. And so I think this will be on our radar more in the future as we go through this process than it's been in the past. And I appreciate learning that. And I also just wanted to say that it's just very gratifying to hear that you guys want to continue the conversation, and we'll figure out how to make it work, as concrete things come up. But I think I feel like this has been a helpful first step in that, and I'm really grateful for you guys at WLT, Andy and Patty, for coming. Patty.
And
Thanks, John.
and I just want to acknowledge that Michael Dewan just popped on, and Michael is like the person that we kind of split in half, because he is probably one of our longest term board members, and virtually since almost the beginning of the Land Conservancy. And as I think Deborah will attest, he probably also knows a whole lot about the housing side and is a remarkable conservation appraiser. And so even though he just popped on, I would say that Michael is one of the most incredible resources, along with Deborah, that Woodstock could have in this effort. So kudos to Michael.
And Deborah.
And Deborah, yeah.
Thank you, Patty. Sorry to be late.
Can I just say one thing? Because I know we're signing off, but I've been, maybe I'm the only one on this committee who's been on the committee since it was formed in 2019. That's a long time. And I'm just so thrilled about this evening and this conversation. And it's kind of what I dreamed is what Woodstock is how we come together to look at what we cherish and look at our needs and come to an understanding of how we could work together to solve our problems and keep our community strong and flourishing. So it's very exciting.
Thanks, Deborah. With that, I think I'll turn the meeting back over to Catherine. I think, I don't know if we have to do anything else formally.
Just quickly, can we just approve the November meeting minutes? Everyone on the committee say aye.
Aye.
And I think that's it, unless we have any speakers for public be heard. No, guess not. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for coming. This was an amazing meeting, and I'm really happy to see everyone here tonight. And thanks to all of you for participating.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, all. Nice to see everybody.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Good night.